Hi class, this is Neil and this is the final video in lesson 11. In this video what we're going to look at is shifting trig waves vertically. So in this example we're asked to graph the equation y equals 2 sine of x plus 3. You'll notice that there's a big difference in this equation from the previous equations we've looked at, and that's that plus 3 that we see here. So what that plus 3 does is it actually shifts our wave up 3 units. If I saw a minus 3, that would mean I'm shifting my wave down 3 units. What that plus 3 also tells us is what our midline is. So because that is a positive 3, that tells me my midline is at y equals 3. So remember, the amplitude is given by the number in front of the sine or cosine function. So that's a 2. My amplitude is 2 here. My frequency is given by the coefficient of x. There's no coefficient of x shown there, so we're going to assume it's 1. So our frequency is 1. That means we repeat one cycle in every 2 pi units. Okay, so finally our period, from the previous lesson, period is the same thing as 2 pi divided by b being my frequency. In this instance, it would be 2 pi divided by 1, so our period is 2 pi units. So we complete one cycle in 2 pi units. Okay, so let's sketch this graph. So to sketch it, I'm going to start by sketching my midline. My midline is at 3, so I'm just going to draw my midline here at y equals 3. The maximum of the function is 2 units above that because the amplitude is 2. So I'm going to just draw another dashed line for my maximum value, and I'll write a 5 there. My minimum value is 1, so that's 2 units below the midline. Now, it doesn't tell me how many periods I need to draw. I know that my frequency is 1. If I look at my x-axis, there's 12 units there. So if I just count up my boxes, there's 12 units from 0 to the end. I'm going to go ahead and write 2 pi there at the end. And now I know that I'm going to just complete one cycle in 2 pi units. Because it's a sine function, I start and end in the middle. And I cross that midline again halfway through the cycle. So that would be 6 units away from 0. All right, so because it's a positive sine function, I'm going to go up to a maximum, back to that midline, down to a minimum, and back to the midline. Just have some arrows there that show that this graph continues. And there I've sketched one cycle of y equals 2 sine of x plus 3. Now, what is the maximum height of the graph? Well, the maximum height is at y equals 5. The minimum height is at y equals 1. So both of those, as you notice, are 2 units away from the midline of 3. Okay, so for the second example, we're really going to be given some information, and we need to use that information to help us graph the function. So we're told on the graph, on the axes, graph a cosine function with an amplitude of 3, a period of pi over 2, and a midline of y equals -1, and passing through the point 0, 2. So let's go ahead and kind of sketch some of that information here. The first thing I'm going to sketch is my midline. So that's y equals -1. So here's -1 on my graph. I'm just going to do a dashed line for that midline. Now, I know the amplitude is 3, so that means that the highest and the lowest I go are 3 units away from that midline. So I'm just going to count up 3 from -1. Okay, so that's my maximum value. And notice that is 2. That's y equals 2. My minimum value is going to be 3 units below -1. So I'm just going to sketch there. Sort of a guideline for that lowest point. And notice that's at -4, or 3 units below. Okay, we also know that that cosine function passes through the point 0, 2. So I'm going to change colors. I'm just going to plot that point for 0, 2. Another thing I know is that the period is pi over 2. So what this means is we complete one cycle in pi over 2 units. Now, we're not told how many cycles to draw. I think to make it easy, what I would do is with my maximum point here, which I'm sort of indicating with that blue point, and maybe I should actually change that to just highlighting it. So highlighting that maximum point, I'm going to write that as pi over 2. Because I know I need to complete one cycle at pi over 2. On the other side, I'm going to write negative pi over 2. All right, so those are my x values. I'm sketching a cosine function. I was given that point 0, 2 as a starting point. So I have to go back to y equals 2 to end that. Now, the cosine function is going to hit a minimum halfway between 0 and pi over 2. So now, I'm going to go down to a minimum and back up to where I started. And I'll just draw an arrow to show that that graph continues. And now it's going to do the same thing on the opposite side because sine and cosine graphs are always symmetrical. They always repeat the same pattern. Right, so halfway through between negative pi over 2 and 0, we also repeat ourselves. And that's what the second half of that wave is going to look like. And again, I can just show an arrow. Now, we're not asked to write an equation for this graph, and it's not going to be required. But if you wanted to, we know almost everything we need to know to write this equation. We know the amplitude. We know the midline. The only thing we don't know is the frequency. Well, if we know that it goes through one cycle in pi over 2 units, one question might be, well, how much do we go through in pi units? Well, we go through 2 cycles in pi units. In 2 pi units, we would be going through 4 cycles. So notice I'm just kind of doubling it each time. So this is our frequency 4. If I were to write an equation for this graph, again, this is not something you'll have to do in this lesson. It'd be y equals my amplitude of 3 cosine of 4x minus 1. And minus 1 because my midline is at -1. Again, what I'm looking for here is really the graph. All right, that's the end of this video and the last video in this lesson.